June 12th, Washington, D.C. A House oversight hearing that was supposed to be about numbers, just numbers, until it wasn't. Because sitting under oath in front of cameras, Kash Patel was asked a question that didn't just challenge his policy, it challenged his truth. And the numbers were already bad. A proposed FBI budget gap of over $1 billion, more than $545 million in cuts, and an agency of nearly 38,000 personnel caught in the middle. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was this: when Madeleine Dean looked directly at him and asked whether the American people should worry more about his memory or his honesty. And what followed wasn't a clarification, it was a collision, a denial, a counterattack, and a moment where a routine hearing turned into something much more dangerous. A test of whether the person leading the FBI could be trusted under oath at all. So let me ask you this. What happens when the man in charge of enforcing the law is now being accused of breaking it?
I've been looking at the president's 120-word FBI budget request, the so-called skinny, I'll call it Ozempic request, that states that, quote, the undoing of the weaponization of the FBI is one of the administration's top priorities. The weaponization of the FBI that is something that deeply concerns me. It should concern all of us. And yet, since taking office, President Trump has been on a revenge tour. He has targeted individuals, universities, law firms, with executive orders to cut them out or to make them come under his will. He has used ICE to disappear U.S. citizens without due process, and he's fully ignored a unanimous Supreme Court order, and then over the weekend wasn't sure if he was obligated to uphold the Constitution of the United States.
This is not a normal hearing. This is a high-stakes confrontation between a sitting FBI director and a congressional watchdog with subpoena power, broadcast in real time, where every word carries legal weight and political consequence. Madeleine Dean is not just another member of Congress, she is a former impeachment manager, someone who has already stood in judgment of presidential conduct. And Kash Patel is not just another witness. He is the head of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the United States, responsible for upholding the Constitution, not redefining it. What you're about to see is a breakdown of a moment where those two roles collided. Hard. The accusations were precise: potential perjury during Senate confirmation, denial of known associations, contradictions tied to January 6th investigations. The response? Not a clean denial, not a documented rebuttal. Instead, a deflection. Tell the American people how I broke the law.
In your book, your recent book, Government Gangsters, you include an appendix with a list of names that people have referred to as an enemies list. Now, I know you will claim it's just an appendix, not an enemies list. So let's focus on how the president sees it, on what the president calls it. And you proudly display his quote on the front cover of your book. The president calls this a brilliant roadmap, a blueprint. And I have not even raised your storied children's book, The Plot Against the King. It concerns me how many people from this blueprint have been targeted with executive orders and FBI investigations. The FBI cannot be weaponized, and under your leadership, it has been nothing but a weapon alongside the president to go after the president's perceived opponents, to stifle dissent and free speech. A few weeks ago, as we saw through a social media post that you quickly deleted, the FBI arrested a judge in Wisconsin for correctly asking ICE officials if they had a judicial warrant instead of an administrative warrant, which they did not have. Despite this judge following the law, on the morning of April the 25th, the FBI arrested the judge in an escalation of the weaponization of the FBI under your leadership. Let me be clear. A functioning democracy does not lock up judges. I am gravely concerned about the utter lack of independence of the FBI and its weaponization under your leadership. I am concerned that the president is using this book, your book, as a blueprint, as he has said.
And right there, the line was drawn. Because in a courtroom, that's not how innocence works. And in Congress, that's not how accountability survives. The problem is not just what was said in that room, it's what had already been said before, under oath, on a completely different day, in a completely different setting, when Kash Patel sat before the Senate and gave answers that are now being pulled back into the light like evidence that never disappeared. Because the allegation here isn't vague, it's not rhetorical, it's not political theater, it's specific. During his confirmation hearing, Patel denied having any involvement as a private citizen in the firing of FBI officials connected to January 6th prosecutions. That statement is on record, time-stamped, archived, and now, according to multiple whistleblowers, directly contradicted. So the first question becomes simple, almost uncomfortably simple. If the statement was false, then what was it, an error or a lie? And that's exactly where Madeleine Dean applied pressure, not by raising her voice, but by tightening the frame. She didn't ask 10 questions. She asked one question that split into two outcomes. Should we be more concerned about your memory or your veracity? That's not rhetoric. That's a legal fork in the road. Because if it's memory, it suggests incompetence at the highest level of federal law enforcement. If it's veracity, it suggests something far worse, intentional deception under oath. Either path leads to the same place, disqualification. And here's where the contradiction sharpens, because this wasn't the only inconsistency raised. Patel also claimed under oath that he was unfamiliar with Stu Peters, despite appearing on his podcast not once, not twice, but 8 separate times. 8. That's not a slip, that's a pattern. You don't forget 8 appearances. You don't accidentally erase repeated public interactions with a known figure and then rediscover them only after being confronted.
It's a blueprint for revenge. And I am concerned that your eagerness, a childlike giddiness to carry out the president's revenge tour, you've shown yourself to be unserious in your statements before you were sworn in and some after. You've shown yourself unfit to lead this important agency. I was an impeachment manager for President Trump's second impeachment. It was a sad, solemn duty. And so I wanted to ask you about that. Mr. Patel, as you and the president continue to weaponize and investigate his perceived enemies, as you follow this blueprint, when can I, a former impeachment manager, expect the FBI at my door?
Ma'am, you want to know who was targeted by a weaponized FBI? Me. You want to know how and why?
Well,
you want to know what I'm doing to fix it?
That. Let me move on.
Well, you should
Change
read the
topics.
book because there's no enemies
So-
list on that book.
So
There are
you-
people that violated their constitutional obligations and their duties to the American people.
That's good. You
And they
gave
were
them due
rightly
process.
called out.
I'm
And
changing
you should
topics.
give that book to every one of your constituents so they can read about it.
I won't be doing that.
That's their loss.
That's not how memory works. And it's definitely not how credibility survives scrutiny. Now shift the lens. Because while this exchange sounds like a personal credibility issue, it doesn't stay personal. It expands. It infects everything tied to the position he holds. The FBI is not just another agency. It is the enforcement arm of federal law, the entity that investigates perjury, obstruction, abuse of power. And if the director himself is now being questioned for those very behaviors, the structure doesn't just crack, it destabilizes. This is where the logic tightens. You cannot lead an institution built on truth while standing on statements that are actively being disputed. And yet, Patel's response didn't resolve that tension. It escalated it.
Mr. Patel, my second question is, should we worry more about your memory or your veracity?
We should worry more about your lack of candor. You're accusing me of committing
Veracity?
perjury. Tell the American people
didn't
how
know.
I broke the law and committed a felony. Have the audacity to actually
No,
put the
all
facts
right, then
forward
the answer is
instead of
both.
lying for political banter so you can have a 20-second
answer
donation hit.
The answer is both. I believe that the
The
men and
answer is
women
you're
of the
failing,
speak,
not
I
me.
reclaim my time.
Go
Instead
ahead.
of clarifying timelines, instead of addressing the 8 appearances, instead of directly reconciling the whistleblower claims, he flipped the burden. Tell the American people how I broke the law. That line sounds strong, it sounds defiant, but legally, it's hollow. Because in any serious inquiry, the burden doesn't begin with theatrical challenge. It begins with consistency. You don't demand proof while ignoring contradiction, you address the contradiction first. And that never happened. So now we're left with a widening gap. On one side, documented statements, whistleblower accounts, recorded appearances, and prior testimony. On the other side, denial without reconciliation, and that gap matters because it's not just about what Patel remembers or denies, it's about what the system tolerates. If a director can give statements under oath that later collapse under basic verification, and the response is deflection instead of correction, then the issue is no longer individual credibility. It becomes institutional permission. And this is where the conversation stops being about a single answer and starts becoming about a system that is being quietly bent out of shape in real time. Because while Kash Patel was deflecting questions about his own statements, Madeleine Dean was stacking something much heavier on the table, evidence not just of contradiction, but of direction. Direction from the top, direction tied to policy, to enforcement decisions, to who gets investigated and who doesn't. And suddenly the hearing is no longer about whether Patel told the truth in the past. It's about what he's doing with power right now. Because here's the second layer, and it's harder to ignore. Dean didn't just question Patel's memory. She connected his leadership to a pattern where federal law enforcement is no longer reacting to crimes, but appearing to follow a script. A script that includes executive orders targeting specific groups, investigations that align too neatly with political narratives, and most critically, an incident that should have stopped the room cold: the arrest of a sitting judge in Wisconsin after that judge asked a simple question about warrants. Not a political statement, a legal requirement. And yet that moment was framed as enforcement. That moment became evidence. Evidence that something deeper is shifting under the surface. Now pause there, because this is where the logic tightens again. The FBI operates on a principle that is supposed to be non-negotiable: independence, not optional independence, not selective independence, full structural separation from political pressure. But when actions start aligning with a so-called blueprint, when a published book tied to Kash Patel includes names that are later echoed in real-world enforcement patterns, the line between policy and retaliation doesn't just blur. It starts to disappear. And that's not a partisan accusation. That's a functional risk. Dean pushed directly into that space, and she didn't soften it. She described the pattern as a weaponization of the FBI, not by its critics, but by its current leadership. That's a reversal of the narrative Patel himself has used. And this is where the contradiction becomes almost impossible to reconcile. Patel claims he is undoing weaponization. Dean presents examples suggesting he is executing it. Both statements cannot be true at the same time. One collapses the other. And then comes the third layer, the money. Because power is one thing, but resources reveal intent. Patel's position in that hearing wasn't just defensive, it was structurally inconsistent. On one side, the administration proposes deep cuts, hundreds of millions stripped from an agency already tasked with countering rising threats. On the other side, Patel himself signals a need for more funding, hinting at a gap that he cannot publicly resolve without contradicting the very administration he serves. That's not just a budget issue, that's a command conflict. So now the contradictions are stacking faster. Statements under oath that don't align with documented appearances, leadership claims that don't align with enforcement patterns, budget positions that don't align with executive direction. And through all of it, one constant remains: the refusal to directly reconcile any of it. No timeline clarification, no acknowledgement of discrepancy. Just deflection, counterattack, and a repeated insistence that the problem is not the answer, but the question itself. At this point, the issue is no longer whether Kash Patel made a mistake. The issue is whether the structure around him is allowing those mistakes, or worse, those contradictions, to stand without consequence. Because if accountability depends on clarity and clarity is replaced with confrontation, then the system doesn't correct itself. It protects itself. And when that happens inside the FBI, the consequences don't stay inside a hearing room. They move outward into every investigation, every decision, every citizen who assumes the law is being applied the same way to everyone. And this is where the moral scene begins, because behind every televised hearing, behind every budget number, behind every sharp exchange between Madeleine Dean and Kash Patel, there are people who do not get a microphone. There are FBI agents who still have to walk into field offices the next morning and decide whether their work will be judged by evidence or by politics. There are judges who have to decide whether asking for a judicial warrant is still a legal safeguard or suddenly a career-ending act of defiance. There are ordinary Americans watching this and wondering whether the same system that can knock on their door can also be bent, branded, and redirected by powerful people who call revenge reform. That is the part no angry soundbite can erase. Because when Dean said a functioning democracy does not lock up judges, she was not just defending one courtroom figure in Wisconsin. She was warning about a line, a very old line, the line between law enforcement and political enforcement, the line between an FBI that investigates crimes and an FBI that appears to punish disobedience, the line between public safety and public fear. And once that line gets crossed, it does not announce itself with sirens. It arrives quietly, wrapped in official language, stamped with agency authority, defended by people who say they are only undoing weaponization while using the machinery of the state against perceived enemies. That is why Patel's answers matter so much. Not because one hearing will decide everything, and not because one Congresswoman's questions can rebuild public trust by themselves. They matter because the director of the FBI cannot operate like a political commentator with a badge. He cannot treat basic oversight as an insult. He cannot answer allegations of perjury by attacking the questioner and then expect the public to pretend the contradiction disappeared. If the issue is false, answer it cleanly. If the appearances with Stu Peters were misunderstood, explain them directly. If the whistleblowers are wrong, bring the receipts. But don't ask the country to accept outrage as evidence. And that is the deeper lesson here. The law is not supposed to be a private security guard for presidents, parties, or personal revenge lists. The FBI is not supposed to become a showroom for loyalty tests. A budget request is not supposed to hide a constitutional crisis behind spreadsheets and staffing numbers. When a law enforcement leader asks for trust, he has to provide more than volume. He has to provide consistency. He has to provide facts. He has to show that the Constitution is not just something he names when cornered, but something he follows when power becomes convenient. So the real meaning of this hearing is bigger than Patel, bigger than Dean, bigger than one explosive exchange over memory and veracity. This is about whether accountability still works when the person being questioned controls the institution that investigates everyone else. It is about whether Congress still has the nerve to demand answers when executive power pushes back. And it is about whether Americans are willing to notice the difference between law enforcement that protects the public and law enforcement that protects the powerful. Because if the FBI director can dodge contradictions, dismiss oversight, and wrap political retaliation in patriotic language, then what exactly is left of equal justice? If a judge can be arrested for asking about a warrant, if agents can fear retaliation for doing their jobs, if whistleblowers become the only reason the truth surfaces, then who is the law really working for? And that is the question this hearing leaves hanging over the room. When the people with the most power are asked for the clearest answers, why do they so often give the country the loudest evasions? If you think this moment matters, hit like, leave a comment, share this video, and subscribe for more hearing breakdowns that follow the evidence, expose the contradictions, and show what these powerful officials are really saying when the cameras are on.